Hi everyone, trigger warning for this episode of The Dark Room. This episode contains discussions of domestic violence, murder, and suicide.
If you or someone you know needs help, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255 or the Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233 or seek out other local resources.
And if you would like to skip that part of the episode, you can skip to 528. Thank you and stay safe out there.
Happy fall, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Dark Room, where two blind cinephiles illuminate the sided. I'm Lee Pugsley.
I'm Alex Howard.
And this is a podcast for film lovers of all abilities, hosted by two legally blind guys. And today we are going to take a slight deviation from our usual film-related content because we have a very special guest with us. We have Ross Miner, who is an accessibility professional who is also blind. He's done a lot in the video game landscape and worked with companies such as Microsoft, Ubisoft, and Rare. And Ross, thank you so much for being on our podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I'm really, really excited to be here. Always love the opportunity to educate about game accessibility, but especially to fellow blind people, because I found that like so many blind people don't know that video games are accessible. So I'm really excited to talk.
Yeah, we're really excited to educate our listeners about the new accessibility features in video games because I know it's a rather new thing that they've been
Mhm.
doing, correct?
Yeah, no, definitely. There's been like snippets here and there throughout history where like some steps have been taken to make games accessible. But it really hasn't been like this movement until like the past 5 years. So it's very, very recent.
Yeah, it seems like it kind of came up really quickly. And truthfully, I didn't even know that games were accessible until, I don't know, probably like 3 years ago.
Yeah,
Um,
that's why I do what I do. Yeah, it's great educating, people who are sighted, and like game studios on accessibility, but I just run across so many blind people who don't know that video games are, can be accessible, and that are currently being made accessible. Because, it makes sense to not even consider it just because traditionally in the past they haven't been in any capacity. So a lot of my work, yeah, is just educating other blind people that hey, like you can do this, and through numbers, the more blind people that want to play, the more that studios notice that.
I know growing up, like Super Smash Brothers and stuff, like I
Mhm.
wasn't the best at that. And like I wasn't necessarily legally blind my whole life, but I definitely have always struggled with my vision my whole life. And
Mhm.
I was never really good at Call of Duty or any of that kind of stuff. Playing games with my friends, I was always usually the worst one at it.
Mhm.
So it's nice to know now that they have settings that help that because, I kind of had resigned myself to not being able to play video games. Usually when we have guests on, especially guests that are blind, we always like to know what their blind journey was. Like, how did you become blind? How old were you? And how did you find the really cool space that you're working in now? So do you want to tell us a little bit about your blind journey, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so as I'm sure you and many listeners may already know that there are many different ways you can go blind, whether it be, disease, being born, etc. Or I was blinded when I was 8. So that was back in 2006. And I guess I always give people a trigger warning just because it is yeah, like not a fun story to hear. But in a nutshell, basically, I was blinded from what people these days call like a family annihilation. Basically, my father committed like or an attempted like double murder suicide. So, my mother was divorcing him, and in an act of retaliation, he shot me in my sleep, did the same to my brother, killed him, and then committed suicide. So I was born with perfect vision, but I literally, went to sleep sighted and like woke up in a hospital bed completely blind. Like I can't see at all. And like sometimes I usually don't go into this much detail, so like cut me off if I shouldn't, but I feel like some blind people may find it interesting, but basically, like the bullet entered in my right temple and exited out my left and into the palm of my left hand. So my right eye, the retina and optic nerve are pretty much severed. So I can't see anything out of that. And then my left eye is had to be removed. So it's a prosthetic. So yeah, that left me totally blind. But that was pretty much how I went blind in a nutshell. As far as how I got to where I'm at today, I mean, man, like it's been a wild ride, that's for sure. And so I guess I'll try to keep it short, but basically I've always liked video games, even before I was blinded. I had a Nintendo 64, I had a PS2, I'd, play Xbox with my friends. I loved it all. And after I was blinded, that love for video games didn't just go away. It's interesting because I feel like if I were blinded as an adult, I probably would have just logically and somewhat understandably assumed that, all right, well, I can never play video games again. But as a kid, you're almost, you can call it that childlike optimism or you can call it naivete, but I wanted to play video games. I was going to find a way to do it. And so, of course, in 2006, Pokemon was huge. And everyone was playing Pokemon, including myself. And I basically, got my Pokemon games that I used to play and basically memorized the games. And like memorized, like so in Pokemon, whenever you enter a new area, like there's usually a different soundtrack for that area, like the music changes. And each Pokemon like has a cry, and each one sounds different. Each attack sounds different. And through that, I was able to memorize the games and like play somewhat independently. And it's like such a hyper specific example because and I'll probably talk about this a bit later, but like there's a few key requirements that you need to make a game accessible. One of them being good sound design. So this Pokemon, the early Pokemon games were very much playable. I would never say that they were accessible, but if I ran into a wall, for example, my character, like it would make a bump sound. It would make this thud sound. So I knew if I just kind of like traced my way around the map, I'd eventually get to where I was going. And I relied a lot on like being able to see that map when I could see. That helped me a lot. And then when newer Pokemon games came out where I had never seen those games before, yeah, it was a bit more difficult, but like I knew it could be done at that point. So was it really tedious? Absolutely. But I still loved it. So most of my life, I grew up only playing Pokemon, and Alex, as you mentioned, Smash as well was somewhat playable, in that it had really good sound design, and I used to be able to see the game. And I would say around like middle school-ish is when Super Smash Bros. Brawl came out, and that was the first Smash game that was in stereo. And for anyone unaware, like stereo audio, basically you can hear where the audio is coming from, like left, center, or right. And fighting games like Smash being 2D, I could hear if I or an enemy is on the left, center, or right side of the stage.
Oh, that's really
Um,
interesting.
yeah, and it was interesting because you had to have headphones to hear that, unless you had like a really good, speaker setup, which most people didn't then or now. But the interesting thing is that like so many consoles back then didn't have any like headphone jack, any way to output like that. So it just so happened that my friend had, I guess, like somewhat of a fancy TV, fancy, at the time, and it had a headphone jack. And so I could plug my headphones into it, and that gave me the stereo audio I needed. And then that really got me thinking about like just the true capability of video games. So like Smash did that, but then also Pokemon, because when I was playing Pokemon, I was like, if they just added this, I would be able to play the game a bit better. So then I would say in high school, I did an AMA on Reddit. And for anyone who doesn't know, Reddit is like a forum website essentially. And AMA stands for Ask Me Anything. And so you basically like post about yourself, who you are, and people ask you questions. And it kind of blew up in ways I didn't really expect it to. And I had mentioned somewhere in the threads that I had played video games and people were interested. They're like, how do you play video games? And so I created a YouTube video showing how I played Mortal Kombat and fighting games in general. It's like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Tekken, Killer Instinct are usually pretty accessible because they're 2D which, there's not a lot of navigation, but then again, that stereo audio. So fighting games are really, really popular in the blind gaming community. And so I learned about Mortal Kombat in like 2011, 2012-ish. Actually, no, a bit later. I think like 2013. I was definitely late to the party because, again, back then, I assumed that I couldn't play video games, that I just happened to get really lucky with Pokemon. But so I showed people how to play Mortal Kombat. People found it really interesting. Like the video blew up on YouTube, and that's what got me started creating content on YouTube and like educating about just how I play video games. And so for many years, I very much did that as a hobby. And it wasn't until like 2018 or so when I really like started to get involved in the game accessibility community. Because you could almost argue that I was very much fragmented before then. And so I actually like began following other blind gamers on Twitter and other accessibility professionals. And I learned that there was a small group of people who have been pushing for game accessibility throughout the years, but even more so. So, I thought that was really cool. It inspired me to keep making content. But then it wasn't until like 2017, EA, the Madden division, I was living in Florida at the time, they were interested in making their game like blind accessible, or at least like adding blind accessibility features to it. I didn't know anything about football. I mean,
Was this
I
Madden 18 or
this
Madden
was Madden
17?
18. Yep.
Wow.
That was the game I worked on. And so they invited me down to their Orlando headquarters and basically test the game for them and like give suggestions and things like that. And like that was my first taste of, oh wow, there are game studios that want to make their games accessible. And you've had like little tidbits of that, like I mentioned earlier, throughout history. So one I always have to mention because it's just, I think it did a lot for the sort of morale in the blind gaming community, is that there is a blind gamer by the name of Carlos Vasquez. He goes by KH Rattlehead online, and big fighting game player, really, really good. Plays a lot of Mortal Kombat, and the people who make Mortal Kombat also create a fighting game called Injustice. And so I think back in like 2011 when Mortal Kombat 9 was new and big, he went to a tournament and competed, and I don't remember how well he did, but he got like some screen time, and everyone, he did a lot to raise awareness to show that blind people can play fighting games. Well, people from NetherRealm were there, and so they asked him like, "Hey, how can we make this game more accessible?" And I don't know all the stuff he suggested, but in their new game, Injustice, new meaning like it came out in like 2013 or something,
That was the
they
DC one, right?
yeah, it was a DC fighting game. They added an accessibility feature, literally just one accessibility feature, but again, it showed that developers were interested in listening. That accessibility feature was literally just a sound. So in Justice, there are interactables, like things that you can interact with in the environment while you're fighting. And so there's a sound when one is available, so you can press the button and use it. And literally, it was just that one tiny feature. But again, that was directly responsible because of Carlos. And so, fast forward to 2018, EA had reached out to me, and I did all that. But I was still very much, I didn't even think it would be like a mainstream thing until I started getting involved in the game accessibility community. And it wasn't until The Last of Us, which is a critically acclaimed game created by Sony, or yeah, Sony PlayStation.
Naughty Dog, right?
Yes, Naughty Dog. Yeah, Naughty Dog is the studio. But they're PlayStation exclusives. So you can only play them on the PlayStation. The Last of Us 2 came out in 2019 or 2020. I think 2020. And it was the very first fully blind accessible AAA game. AAA meaning like high budget. So there were games in the past made by like indie developers, or maybe even like accessibility mods to games that you can play on your computer.
Can you explain what a mod is? Sorry.
Yeah, an accessibility mod is, or just a mod in general, like basically you can, whatever game you buy and play on your PC, a mod is like a program or like a plugin essentially that you download, install into the game, and it provides like additional functionality. So like a lot of able-bodied or sighted people use it to make characters look different or add new features in the game. And so accessibility mods are exactly what they sound like. They make the game more accessible for whatever disability. And some of those were starting to pop up then, but the blind gaming was very much still like relegated to audio games, which are basically, what they sound like, games that are audio only. There's a big community online, but it's kind of shrinking because of how many video games are accessible now. So when The Last of Us came out and I learned that there were blind people involved in working on it, I was like, wow, like people are really, really listening. Like this is going to be a snowball effect. And sure enough, it was. But more so, it showed me that like there was work in this. And so like at the time I was in the Paralympics and I was competing in swimming, and then the pandemic hit, Tokyo Games got delayed, and I was just like, Paralympics was fun, but I never really considered myself to be an athlete. I know it sounds kind of strange, but I kind of just did it because I was good at it. And like even good is subjective, but I did it because I could, but it wasn't my passion by any means. Gaming was my passion. And so I decided to retire from the Paralympics and, continue going to college and kind of break into the gaming accessibility industry because it was something I very much believed would continue to grow. Because when it comes to creating games, there's like what's called a development life cycle where, I won't get too technical with it, but with anything that you're building, especially video games or software, you have the blueprints, you have the mock-ups and everything, and then you have to build it. And only changes can only be made so far before you have to like finalize the game and release it to the public. And so generally with gaming, with video games, it's like 3 years. That's the life cycle. And so, 2020 is when The Last of Us 2 came out. And so basically it's like, all right, we got 3 years to see how studios react to this game coming out, having all these accessibility features. How are they going to react to a game that can be completed from beginning to end without any sighted assistance? And sure enough, like in 2023, of course, 2022 and 21, like there are some gems, but 2023, you had the new Mortal Kombat that came out. It was like the most accessible fighting game ever. You had Forza Motorsport, the very first blind accessible racing game. You had Spider-Man 2, which is blind accessible in many ways. There's even a blind Street Fighter player because Street Fighter, while not as accessible as Mortal Kombat, it has blind accessibility features. And as a result, this guy literally won a Street Fighter tournament. I think his name is Blind Warrior Sven. I forget where it was. I want to say like Japan, maybe. I think that's where the tournament was. But like just for context, like Street Fighter is one of the most competitive fighting games out there. Like it's much bigger than Mortal Kombat in general. Like it just has a much bigger fan base than Mortal Kombat. And so to have a blind guy win a tournament is just massive. And he did it because, yeah, fighting games were already somewhat accessible, but also because of these accessibility features. And so that's, I mean, pretty much where I am now. I began marketing myself as someone who wants to help make games accessible. And so as a result, like I've helped design new features for games. I've helped implement audio descriptions into the games, which I'm sure many people didn't even know was a thing that, yeah, audio descriptions are in video games now. And I've given presentations at like South by Southwest or the Game Accessibility Conference about game accessibility. So it's very, very much a huge movement that's happening. And so I know that was like a lot, that was a massive info dump, but that's kind of where I am today. That's how I got here.
First of all, like your whole journey into the gaming industry and just even with what happened and how you lost your vision, I mean, all of it's really interesting and fascinating. And I think it's just cool that I'm a firm believer that for any of us in, the blind community, it's like, we can still find a way to do what we love to do. And I love hearing, about people like you that just, do it. And
Mhm.
kind of going to The Last of Us too, like when that
Mhm.
came out, and maybe even touching on other games too. Because I haven't played video games in a very long time for, visual reasons, and
Mhm.
just assuming that that's not something that I could do anymore.
Mhm.
When you refer to blind accessibility features, can you just go into a little more detail on
Mhm.
what those kind of features are? I'm
Yeah.
genuinely curious because
Yeah. So yeah, with The Last of Us 2, or just blind accessibility in general, I always say that there are three things to make a game blind accessible generally. And that is good sound design to let you know when certain events happen in the game, a screen reader so you can actually read all the text in the game, and then navigation assistance, so you can actually know where you are going in the game. And sometimes you don't need nav assist because like fighting games don't need nav assist. Other times, like sound design isn't as important. So like it very much at the end of the day depends on the game. So it's not like a one size fits all option, as with most things, accessibility. So for The Last of Us specifically, like this, I should have said earlier, but like this isn't an easy game. This is an action adventure, like almost horror game. Basically the game is about a zombie apocalypse essentially, and navigating your way through that. That's a very, very basic description. I won't get into the story or spoil anything, but it's like a story-driven game, but is very violent, is very gory. So like it's not many times I know blind people, especially myself, feel like sometimes we're like put on training wheels with certain things, and that's not just like on game accessibility, just making things accessible in the first place. But this is very much not that. So as such, there are first like navigating the game. This is a story-driven game. Like you are navigating through the world, and their first attempt at doing this, we like to call it sort of this golden path, where basically you can press a button and it'll point you in the direction of the objective you need to go. And then once you reach almost like we'll call them like a node, and I'll explain that in a second. Once you reach a node, it will play a sound to let you know you need to press the nav assist button again to point you in the right direction. So it's almost like connect the dots if anyone's familiar with that. I know it's sort of like a visual example, but basically there are all these like points, and it will bring you from point A to point B to point C to point D and bring you through the level. So it's like this, yeah, like a golden path that keeps you on the path. Doesn't mean you can't deviate from the path, but that's how navigation works. But then there are, of course, items in the game. And so there is a button you can press that almost sends out this like sonar ping, and you can hear where all the items are and like press a button and it will guide you to it. Um, there are like sound cues for when you need to break a window, when you need to vault over something, when you need to climb under something, etc. Like there are so many different ones. And then finally there is a screen meter, so you can actually know what you're reading in the game. But that's it in a nutshell. And again, like it was just groundbreaking for all the games to come, you know?
I played a little bit of The Last of Us 2. I have a PS4,
Hmm.
which I noticed on the PS4, it's great because like on the menus, you can turn on the voiceover and it'll read you what you're selecting on the menu. So that's cool in itself.
Hmm.
But then in the actual game, the reason I bought Last of Us 2, I mean, I watched the show and I know
Hmm.
the remaster of the first game has the accessibility features, but that's only on the PS5.
Yep.
So I bought Last of Us 2 to experience the accessibility features. And I think the first thing that stood out to me is I have a lot of trouble with they have like the clips in between um where you're playing. And a lot of times there's parts where it's like, oh, you need to press a button a bunch of times to get through
Hmm.
part. And they kind of skip that so
Hmm.
that because I can't see what button it's telling you to press
Hmm.
rapidly. And then
Hmm.
the other thing I noticed is the colors, you can kind of invert them. So I
Hmm.
think when I was playing, my characters were like big purple blocks, and then
Hmm.
I was going towards the yellow part of the map, and
Hmm.
so it made things a lot easier to visually see because I know Last of Us is a very dark game.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And like on the parts where you have to press specific buttons, there is actually a sound cue for that. There is a learning curve to playing video games. There's a learning curve for like most assistive technology. You know what I mean? Like screen readers. Like people don't just pick up a screen reader and like know how to use it. There's a learning curve, and unfortunately, it's the same for gaming. And so what I've found, and even now, when developers are making games and making them accessible, they assume a lot of things are implicitly known. They assume that like you've played video games before, but for many blind gamers, this is their very first time playing any game.
Especially for Last of Us 2.
Yeah, I mean, like it was my first time like playing a story-driven, action adventure game since I was blinded, So it's been well over a decade since. And so because of that, sometimes I feel they don't explain accessibility features enough within the game. So that's something I feel like should be worked on more. So I don't blame you for not even knowing that. Like there are so many things, even when I play video games, like, I stream on Twitch and I'll be doing something whatever way, and someone in chat will be like, "Oh, you could do this, right?" And I'll just be like, "Oh, I had no idea you could do that. Thank you for telling me." So there's very much a learning curve, but it's still, tons of fun in my opinion.
Is the blind gaming community, is it pretty large? Like, are you connected to other blind gamers?
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, it's very large. It's large, but it's also fragmented because there's not really so there used to be like audiogames.net and it's still around, but again, like it's mainly audio game focused. And so like there is discussion there about mainstream gaming, but it's a really old website and there are a lot of issues with it that I won't go into. But it's been around for a couple decades, and so it's kind of starting to show its age. Then there are like Reddit communities, but again, it's fragmented. But then the biggest communities are on Discord. And for anyone who doesn't know what Discord is, it's basically like a chat client that centers around it can be used for anything, but it is targeted towards gamers. And basically there are servers, which are basically like different sections. I'm trying to think like the best way to describe it. But basically you can create a server and then have channels within that server and like voice channels, text channels, and like people can join, you can chat in different channels, da da da. And so there are many different blind gaming servers, but the thing is that it's all contained within Discord. It's not a website. It's not something you can Google search. And so as such, there's like a ton of good information on there, but many blind people don't use Discord. Many blind people have never even heard of it. So it's very much fragmented. I've actually been working on a project. It's technically out right now. I haven't worked on it in several weeks just because I've been busy with like work and travel. But I created a website called accessiblegaming.wiki. And the goal of it is to be a community-driven website where all info about game accessibility can be written down. So obviously, since I'm blind, like I specialize in blind accessibility, but my hope is that someone who is deaf will come along and make sections about deaf accessibility for XYZ game and so on. So it's up right now. It's very like sparse, so to say. But it's there, and I'm hoping people will start contributing to it. I have a lot of work that I still want to get done on it, but the goal is, yeah, like someone can search, is so and so blind accessible, or insert game name blind accessibility, and the wiki will show up just to make it easier for people to actually get started. Because I
And it has
think
all
that,
like the
Mhm.
game settings and stuff on there, like what accessibility settings the game has and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
We
That's
will definitely link to that in the description.
Yeah, please do. And so, it's an up and coming project, but I'm really, really passionate about it. And I think it will go a long way. Like right now, I think the pages that have been like worked on the most are like the Spider-Man 2 page and like the Diablo 4 page. That one has a lot of info on it. And I don't know, I really like the idea of it because there are so many different pockets of the blind accessibility community that have a lot of good info that needs to be shared. So yeah, I'm excited to see that project grow.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool idea of just trying to get all that information into one space. And hopefully, as the
Hmm.
word spreads, people will see the benefit of that. I mean, I even remember like for a while, I didn't even know what audio description was. And
Yeah.
I didn't start using audio description until 2018, and I just didn't know about it. And so it's
Hmm.
like that's a more widespread thing. But I mean, with gaming, it's like, yeah, let's start spreading that awareness. And in regards to like, spreading awareness, I know that you, have played a part in advancing video game accessibility. So what does that look like for you the last couple of years? Is it more so talking to people within the video game community that are making the decisions in development, or does it involve you playing a video game and then reviewing it, giving them notes, or are there other ways that maybe I'm not aware of that you've been playing a part behind the scenes with accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, it's like really all of the above. So, as I mentioned before, I speak at a lot of conferences, and I think that, has raised a lot of awareness in and of itself. Because that's half of the battle, right? It's just awareness. Like get people thinking about it in the first place. But primarily it is working with developers. And that, yeah, that could take many forms. It could be, hey, can you play test this game and like write up a report and send it back to us? Or it could be, hey, can you like give a presentation to our UX team for this game, or hey, can we do like a Q&A with you for this game? Da 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 da. So it takes many different forms like that, or on occasions like they'll have you come in and design features from the ground up. Like one thing that I did semi recently, the studio Rare creates a game called Sea of Thieves. It's like a pirate role-playing action game. And that game is blind playable in the sense that you can't play by yourself, but it is a multiplayer, like team-based game. So most people do play with friends. And so as such, they have tried to make it blind accessible in the ways that are easiest to first. So like if you played with a group of people, you would have a role on that team. So for example, you're on a ship, like there's going to be someone who needs to man the cannons if like an enemy comes by. There's going to need to be someone who can look at the map and navigate. And there's going to be someone who needs to steer the ship. And that is what they've actually leaned into, is making that blind accessible. So there are a lot of, different things I can go into about Sea of Thieves, but one of the features that I helped design is essentially while steering the ship while out at sea, there are rocks in the ocean. And being blind, you don't want to run your ship into rocks or everyone's going to sink. And we basically designed a feature where if you turn it on in settings, you will be able to hear the waves or the water like lapping up against the side of the rocks, and it'll be in stereo. So they sort of amplified that sound. And so when you are steering the ship, you can hear the rocks out at sea and navigate around them accordingly. So, things like that really are good design, and are at the end of the day, pretty easy things to implement. And so like those are the kind of features I do.
It also seems like it's seamless, whereas like the sighted audience it makes it more realistic for them as well.
Exactly. It's very much like accessible by design, as opposed to creating an accessibility feature specifically for this disability. There are many different philosophies when it comes to accessibility, especially when it comes to creating video games.
Can you explain how does audio description work in video games? Like, I know in movies, they don't talk over dialogue.
Mhm.
Is it the same rules for video games, or like or is audio description only in the cutscenes and not when you're actually playing, or how does that all work?
Yeah, good question. So like a bit of background, I work with a company called Descriptive Video Works, and so
Oh,
far
I do
they've
too.
been, oh yeah, that's
I
cool.
think I think we connected
I
at
think, yeah, I
the
think
same, yeah.
you're right. You're right. Yeah, we did. I guess also for context, Alex, you and I met at like a slam dance event, like film event a couple months ago at this point. Um,
Yeah.
and Lee and I met at the gym. Like we just happened to run into each other. And so we both live in the same area. So it's really funny. Small world. But so I work with Descriptive Video Works. I'm on their advisory board, but then I also do audio description narration. And so they have been responsible for most of the audio description in video games. I think like all except for one game. So they've added audio description to Forza Motorsport, Spider-Man 2, Mortal Kombat, both of the Last of Us games. And yes, it is very much pretty much the same conventions as a movie. So considering that cutscenes in video games are literally just, movies, they follow all the same standards. There are some times where audio descriptions are almost like flow seamlessly into the gameplay. It hasn't, I would love to see for a game to do this. It hasn't been yet where like there are audio descriptions going as you're playing the game, like as you're able to press buttons. Or what I mean, like they flow seamlessly is like, let's say you're playing Mortal Kombat and you're in the middle of a fight. In Mortal Kombat, I keep wanting to call them by their old name, but I think they're called fatal blows, or basically like a big super move. So those, they do a lot of damage, but they're literally a cutscene within the middle of the fight, and those are described. So you'll be fighting, you'll do your super move, it'll describe all the gory details, and then you'll go back to fighting. And it's really cool
That
to
sounds
see that.
awesome.
Oh, it's awesome. I mean, like more anyone who doesn't know anything about Mortal Kombat, it is a very gory game, like one of the goriest games you could find.
And as a horror fan, I appreciate that.
Oh yeah, yeah. And so they describe all of it. They leave nothing to the imagination. It's a huge passion of I've always loved Mortal Kombat, and so just to see how accessible like the new one is absolutely incredible.
And then for like Last of Us, do they like describe the creatures and like when you're I know so for people that don't know in Last of Us there's like you're like sneaking around
Mhm.
to try and attack the zombie like things and they have a really unique look to them. Do
Mhm.
they describe that at all?
Yeah, they do in the sense they follow general AD standards and that when they appear for the first time, they'll describe them. So like clickers, for example, this is a type of infected. If I remember correctly, like they have like this almost like fungus
Yeah, like the
that grows
cordyceps.
over their like head and everything, and I'm pretty sure they're actually blind, which is kind of funny. But it describes those at like the beginning of the game, but then later on, if there's a cutscene, it'll just say a clicker. You know what I mean? But it very
Hmm.
much does describe them. Yeah.
With kind of the advancements that have been taking place within accessibility for video games, do you ever see a time where audio description would be a part of the actual game itself, like when someone's navigating around an open world area or something? Because I know you said right
Mhm.
now audio description isn't happening when you're actually like moving through the game.
Yes. Hmm.
But do you
This
think that could happen?
I think it could. Many people have different theories on how to implement this, whether it's possible or not. I'm of the belief that it is, and I'm gonna get kind of technical with it, but many people say like, how can it be done when games are so dynamic and so you don't like they're not sequential? So how would the AD know when to play? But the example I give is like, let's say you're playing, I don't know, Grand Theft Auto, right? Game that's notoriously not accessible for blind people at all, has no audio descriptions.
Wouldn't that be great if the new one had it?
I know, right? It would be. But basically, you're driving around the city and a car crashes in front of you. Well, you may ask, how are you going to describe that? How are you going to have the right lines? And I would argue that programmatically is how you would do it. And so what I mean by that is, let's say the car that crashes in front of you is a blue Corvette. Programmatically, like with code, you will be able to see that the car is blue. I'm not doing the best at describing this. I'm like trying to simplify it, but basically, when you code things, you try to make it legible. And so when you have all these assets, so assets meaning like the design of the car, how the car looks, the fact that the car is blue, the fact that it looks like a Corvette, all of that is written in code. And so in code, you will have like color equals blue, car equals Corvette, etc. And let's say this blue Corvette crashes into something, well then all you would have to do is add another attribute to that Corvette where it's like audio description line equals Corvette crashes. And so it wouldn't be specific like exactly word for word what is happening, like what you're seeing, but it could very much be like a Corvette in front of you crashes and things like that. And so all that to say, I know that's like a bit technical. I believe it can be done. It's very much experimental. I do think we'll get there because, to be honest, I didn't expect game studios to embrace audio description as quickly as they did. I thought it would take many years for that to happen, but here we are, and multiple games have it now. So I do think that it can happen. I also believe that there can also be like audio description by design through a screen reader, in the sense that almost no games right now do this except for audio games because they're made by blind people usually. And so, blind people know what blind people need. I would love for screen readers to actually describe more about what you're walking around. Like there are audio descriptions for cutscenes, but when you're actually walking through a level, you don't get anything. So like what if you were just walking around a city and you were at an intersection and it read the intersection name, like just like real life, or let's say you passed a car and it said the car model and year and things like that, or let's say you walked like past a storefront and it read that out loud. Like it's not audio description, but it's still by design when it's telling you what's around you. That is a way of describing it. So I think those kind of things could be used in conjunction to, yeah, really describe your environment. So I really hope that something like that can be done.
You're almost talking about like if you were to go to Disneyland and get the audio description device and put on navigation, it'll tell
Yeah,
you what you're walking by like that, right?
yeah, exactly, exactly.
I don't know. To me, that seems like it should be pretty doable. And once again, I don't understand the technical side of all of this, but
Mhm.
like just, with apps like Seeing AI or different apps that, like, you scan your environment and it'll tell you what the camera's passing as it's passing.
Exactly.
It's like, so if we already have that in, like, built in with like phone apps and stuff, and that can capture that, it's like, if screen readers can capture things that way, then it seems like they should be able to capture on video games to describe those environmental attributes too.
I agree. Like, I don't think there's any reason you literally can't implement like a blind GPS similar to like Voice Vista or Microsoft Soundscape or whatever into a video game. I think the thing with game development is there are deadlines. At the end of the day, they're trying to make money. And so what a lot of people don't understand is that if a feature is implemented into a game, like audio description, they had to code that in. They had to set up that infrastructure to allow audio description to be put in. But they have it now. It's programmed. They have it for the next game. And so it's much, much easier and quicker to implement in the next game. Same with screen readers. Screen readers are very difficult currently to implement into a game and require a lot of coding. But once they're in, they're in. And so as a result, like Ubisoft, for example, most of their games that come out now have screen readers because it surely took them a long time for the first game, but now out of nowhere, all their games have screen readers because it's so simple to, or not simple, of course, but it's so much easier for them to implement. And all that to say, like, just because a feature isn't in now doesn't mean it's not being worked on because it just takes time. But once they've made it, they have it and it works in the future, which is a good thing.
So if we have a blind listener who is like, "Oh my God, video games are accessible. I didn't know that,"
Mhm.
and they want to get started, what console do you recommend, and what would you say are the top three games to like start your blind journey with?
Ooh, good question. So it's funny because like in the past, I would have said Xbox all the way, because they actually were the first to come out with a screen reader on their console. But now I would actually say PlayStation. So there are pros and cons to both, or to Xbox versus PlayStation versus PC, and then there's Nintendo, which Nintendo is notoriously bad about accessibility, so I almost consider it just
Which is
a no-go.
ironic because you were just saying that like
I
Pokemon
know.
and Super Smash were like the ones you started with.
Yeah, and I'm not the only blind person to play Pokemon or Smash. And so like you think Nintendo, it's a whole thing. But
Yeah.
so there's a lot of factors. If you have a capable PC, because video games, depending on the game, some are really easy to run, like you could run on a calculator, others you need a beefy computer to run. But if you have a good enough PC, I would say go for PC because Xbox games are almost always cross-platform onto PC because Windows is a Microsoft product. If you use a Mac, unfortunately, like the game accessibility scene there is dead, just because I mean gaming in general on Apple devices is dead for many reasons. So many Xbox, if not most Xbox games, you can play on PC, and then PlayStation exclusive games usually come to PC eventually. And so it's kind of the best of both worlds if you can afford it, but it is a bit more like technical in the sense that you have to be familiar with computers and know like that you have the right specs and everything. However, something that PCs have that consoles do not have are mods. And so you are given a larger pool of games to select from on PC because you have the capability to mod games. And so I would recommend PC. And then if not, consoles are still great. So between PlayStation and Xbox, I would say PlayStation for sure. They just have more accessible games. So on PlayStation, in terms of games that are just completely blind accessible through and through, you have Mortal Kombat, you have the Last of Us games, you have As Dusk Falls, which is a game I worked on.
What is that game about?
So that's a really fun game. So it's a story-based, like narrative-driven, like choose your own adventure type game. So there's no like navigation. You primarily through the entire game select options from a menu. Um, but it's like there are cutscenes in the game and you follow the story, but the options you choose impact what happens in the story. And it's really fun because it's multiplayer as well. So you can play with friends, you can play with family, and like if you play with friends and family, like if like the vote on which option to pick is tied, like it'll shuffle it. There is now audio description in the game as well. And then you can even like play online like while streaming with other people as well. So it's just a really, really fun game. It has lots of replayability because after each chapter in the story, you can like see how other people voted and like what your choices mean about or say about you. It's just a fun game. And that was a game that used to only be on Xbox, but now is on PlayStation as well. And so, yeah, for PlayStation, to reiterate, completely blind accessible. You have Mortal Kombat, As Dusk Falls, The Last of Us games. Then you have games that are very, very playable, but sometimes you may need assistance. So like Spider-Man 2, very, very accessible. But there are some places where like it's a bit more difficult. Like it's not the most accessible. And that's kind of where like why I created the game accessibility wiki for info like that. Because I have articles linked on the wiki for like those problematic areas of Spider-Man 2.
Is Hogwarts accessible?
No, it is not. It has blind accessibility features, but like just I wouldn't even call it playable, unfortunately.
Mm.
But then there's Diablo 4, which again, like that's on Xbox and PC. But if we're just talking about like a console that has the most, Diablo 4 has a really good screen reader. It's very much playable, but it takes a lot of patience because there's no navigation assistance. However, it is being worked on and it is set to be released in October. So next month there will be navigation assistance in Diablo.
And that's only
Um,
on Xbox or that's PS5 as well?
no, that's on all platforms, but again, like if you're wanting a console that has everything or the most things, we're talking consoles alone, because otherwise, of course, I would say play on PC. But the most just accessible games, regardless of console, of course, are the Last of Us games. I would say Mortal Kombat, and it is. But like, fighting games have already kind of been playable. This one just takes it to a new level and it's like very, very accessible now. But
Is it just called Mortal Kombat or what number is it? Sorry.
so no, you're good. And it's actually confusing because they recently like did a reboot, like they kind of did their whole multiverse thing. I'm not really a fan of it, but I'm talking about like stuff that Marvel does. So they're calling it Mortal Kombat 1. So it's like a reboot of the franchise. And the only game that Microsoft has that is, completely blind accessible, that is exclusive to Microsoft, so either Xbox or again PC, because best of both worlds, is Forza Motorsport, and that is a racing simulation game. So it has a very high skill curve, but it is 100% accessible. And in fact, since it's a simulation, you can buy what's called a racing rig, which is like a wheel that you can mount on like your desk, for example, and you have pedals that go on the ground. And you literally have the feeling of driving a race car because like the wheel vibrates and everything, and the pedals, feel like actual pedals. But like the wheel is more than just vibration. Like if your car spins out, your wheel will spin out. Like it very much feels like driving a race car. And so it's quite literally the very first time like a blind person could get the feeling of driving a car in a safe environment at full speeds. You know what I mean? Like it's different from trusting a sighted person to help you drive in a parking lot where you have to be careful. Like it's not like that. You know what I mean? That is the only game on Xbox that is not on PlayStation, but there are actually rumors that Forza Motorsport is coming to PlayStation. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's just a rumor. So yeah, to reiterate, I would say The Last of Us, Forza, Mortal Kombat. If you're like new to gaming, because these are all AAA games and they take some skill. If you're new to gaming, though, I would absolutely suggest As Dusk Falls. I think that's a great game. On PC, there are a lot of accessibility mods that I should mention. Some are more difficult to use, some are a lot easier. And some of these games are pretty easy to run. So like you don't need a powerful computer. So the popular game Hearthstone has a accessibility mod that makes it completely accessible. Stardew Valley has an accessibility mod, so that's a really popular game. Very, very easy to run. There are even accessibility mods for old Pokemon games. So if you run them on an emulator, which is an emulator is essentially a program on your computer that you can load the game into and play as if you're playing it on like the original console. There are mods to make Pokemon games accessible.
So like the original Pokemon game?
So currently generations 1 through 3. So red, blue, yellow, gold, silver, crystal, fire red, leaf green, ruby, sapphire, emerald.
That is so
Um,
cool.
Yeah,
I grew up
no,
on yellow, so
yeah, no, exactly. Like it's amazing. And yeah, there are just so many. There's accessibility mods for World of Warcraft. Yeah, there are a bunch. But if we're talking consoles, I would absolutely recommend PlayStation. I could get into like so many different accessibility features. And if you have an Xbox, it's not I, it's not bad at all. Like you still have Diablo, Mortal Kombat, like those games are on all platforms. You have As Dusk Falls, then you still have Forza Motorsport. But like the level of detail that goes into like PlayStation games is really good. God of War Ragnarok is very playable. There are a lot of parts that are difficult. However, PlayStation is releasing God of War Ragnarok on PC, and so I'm hoping that maybe they added some updates to make it more playable. I actually recently got a code for the game, so I'm going to shortly see if that is the case. I'm hoping, because it is very, very close to being completely accessible.
you do reviews and videos on your Instagram too, right?
Not on my Instagram. I primarily do them on my YouTube. And I also sometimes write articles on my website, rossminer.com. But YouTube is kind of like where I do accessibility reviews. I usually write my articles if a game is close, but like not the most accessible. Because like I would hate to create a video and just be like, and it's not accessible. So like it's just like what's the point in my opinion? If I'm gonna create a video about game being accessible, like I want people to hear how it's accessible. But then that's also what I do my Twitch for is for blind people to just come in and chat and ask me questions like, hey, how do you play XYZ game? Is this game accessible? Etc. And so yeah, my YouTube is same everywhere. It's youtube.com/rossminer, twitch.tv/rossminer, all that good stuff.
Great. We will link all of that in the description. Lee, did you have any last questions for Ross?
No, I feel like I've learned so much from this conversation, and yeah, thank you so much for being here, Ross, and just thank you for just helping to advance accessibility within the video game field. Hopefully, more blind and low vision people will start tapping into some of those games now that they have an awareness that there is accessibility in the gaming world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And like you guys literally we all live in the same area, so I'm always happy to like give in-person demos if you guys are curious about a game or want to test a game before you buy it because that's a really real thing of like buying a game and then realizing it's not really for you. So you can always hit me up whenever. I'd be happy to help out.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. And we will definitely link you, like I said, in the description. Thank you for coming on and being so vulnerable and, just your story was very moving and I think you give a lot of great info. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you as well.
If any of you listeners out there want to get a hold of me and Alex, you can always reach us at darkroomfilmcast@gmail.com. Once again, that's darkroomfilmcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram and YouTube at Darkroom Filmcast.
Ross, did you want to give any other contact info for yourself or they can just reach out to you through YouTube or things like that?
Yeah, so I actually have all my like social media links in one place. So it's just rossminer.com/links, and you'll find just all my social media, my Discord links. If you want to join my Discord, you can ask me questions there. Yeah, you can find it all right there.
Great. And we also want to thank Matt Lauterbach and All Senses Go for creating captions and helping us make our podcast more accessible. We'd like to thank Jamie, which is Guy on a Wire on YouTube, for editing our podcast.
And that will wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will see you here next time on The Dark Room.
Thanks, guys.